c-span.org. We'll take you live now to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Now that the midterm elections are over, a look this evening at how the turnout of voters of different religious groups may have impacted the results. It's just getting started, live here on C-SPAN.
On faith and the faithful in U.S. politics, exploring the intersection of faith, politics, and public life. Tonight we'll focus on the roles that faith, religious voters, and faith communities played in the outcomes of the 2018 midterm elections, and how they're helping shape the political and religious direction of our nation. We'll ask who won and lost and why, and explore the context, opportunities, and challenges Catholics, evangelicals, and other religious groups face in the current environment of political polarization, ecclesial scandal, and overall neglect of issues related to the poor and vulnerable. As we consider such questions tonight, we'd like to in particular thank our co-sponsors, the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service and the Democracy Fund, as well as our colleagues at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs and the Office of Global Engagement. We're honored to have such a thoughtful group with us tonight, including Robert Costa, Elizabeth Diaz, Ana Gonzalez-Barrera, and Greg Smith, and we look forward to hearing their perspectives. John Card, the director of the initiative, will moderate our discussion. Now, as many of you know, the initiative is in its 5th year of offering a respected forum for principled dialogue on issues at the intersection of Catholic social thought and public life, bringing Catholic principles to the conversations that matter. And we're bringing leaders together as well to help think through the most challenging questions facing us in these challenging times. Please join our conversation tonight on Twitter at GUCST Public Life using the hashtag #FaithfulMidterms. Many thanks to you all and to our panelists, and let's get started.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kim, and thank you for coming out in such numbers on the Monday of Thanksgiving week. As some of you know, we have done a series of intense, sometimes anguishing discussions of the clerical sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. The last time I was on this stage, we opened up with someone who described his abuse for the first time publicly. And those have been important and moving and insightful, but we thought we'd take up something that really is much more uplifting. Something that gives us a great deal of hope. Our president is such a good example. Our leaders have come through this election poised to work together for the common good. Faith has been such a helpful insight as we made our choices. We thought this would be the time and these would be the people to have a real discussion on faith and the faithful in the midterms. Actually, it is very important. Since faith and faithful people should be resources for the renewal of American public life, especially when our country is so divided and our government so paralyzed. And we do so at an insightful time. We just had an election all across America. People are gathering for Thanksgiving with their extended family with 3 or 4 words in their heads. Whatever you do, don't discuss religion and politics. It'll destroy Thanksgiving. Well, we're not taking those warnings. We have invited 2 wonderful journalists and 2 preeminent researchers together to help us understand more clearly how faith shaped the election and how faithful impacted the outcome. Robert Costa, as many of you know, is a national correspondent with the Washington Post, and in the last year has become the moderator of Washington Week on PBS. He drew the short straw and was asked by the Post to cover the improbable, of no consequence election campaign of a businessman from New York. So he knows more about Donald Trump than the rest of us put together. Elizabeth Diaz is a national correspondent covering faith and politics for the New York Times. If you're looking for a Christmas gift, It's a wonderful book. What would Jesus ask? Where she posed that question to all sorts of religious leaders. And then we have two. Pew is absolutely the source for good information on these topics. And we have two of their best researchers and an analyst in Anna, I don't get this right, Gonzalez-Barrera, is that close? Who's going to help us understand the role of the Latino community. Often when we talk about faith in public life, the role of Catholics or evangelicals, we're talking about white Catholics or white evangelicals. And Anna's going to help us dig deeper and broader. And Greg Smith is someone who covers religion and politics broadly, but especially focuses on Catholics. We deliberately have reporters and researchers with us tonight, not pundits, public officials, or religious leaders, because when it comes to discussion of religion and politics, we have a lot of proclamation and a lot of opinion, some rationalization, some spin, but we really don't have much reporting, enough reporting, and we don't have enough facts. And so we have reporters and researchers. Pew, as you know, is a nonpartisan organization that analyzes public opinion. And so they're not in a position to offer advice to the parties or frankly to us. And in Robert and Elizabeth, we have two young reporters, but more importantly, two of the best reporters, two of the most respected reporters that cover the intersection between faith and public life. There would be some people that would say this is really a dumb idea. When you put faith and public life together, politics together, you threaten both. And in fact, when you inject faith into politics, it represents a danger to both faith and politics. And our conviction is at the initiative that believers have the same rights, no more, no less, than other citizens, that if we should expect no favoritism nor discrimination in the exercise of our rights as citizens, and that when people bring their deepest convictions to questions of war and peace, questions of life and death, who moves ahead and who gets left behind, we enrich political life. Because if you're not talking about fundamental values, then it can only be about power and money and ego. And we've seen some evidence of what politics looks like when it's mostly about power and money and ego. There are some people who would say this is an outdated conversation. Religious voters are a diminishing part of public life. You got to talk about the nuns, and they don't mean the nuns on the bus. Our friends at Pew will talk about this. It is true that the number of people of faith with an explicit religious affiliation are declining, but we shouldn't minimize our role and our presence in this society. Using Pew data, 73% of voters in the midterms were Christians, self-identified Christians. That's larger than men and women as a subgroup, African American, Latinos, and Anglos, Democrats or Republicans. Some say that we use our religion only as a rationale for our partisan preferences or our ideological positions or our social prejudices, but I think it's deeper and more complicated than that. And so it would be a mistake to either exaggerate or ignore the influence of faith and the faithful. So with that, I want to turn to our panel and ask all of them the same question, and then I'll return with a more specific question. What is your assessment of what happened and why at the intersection of faith and politics? What role did the Latino community and religious communities play in the outcome? And specifically, what was the most important thing that happened in this combination? And what was the most surprising thing that happened? They don't have to be the same thing. So, Robert, why don't we start with you and just work down the table?
Well, it's an honor to be back here at Georgetown University. Really appreciate the invitation and to be with these great panelists. It's a wonderful place, and I always like coming here. Sometimes I even go to the business school to study, work on articles. I can still blend in, I think, as a business student. But that time will eventually pass, but for now I can do it. But I've had a lot of fun getting ready for tonight, because after the election, I've spent the last 2 weeks roaming around the halls of the Capitol, talking to lawmakers in both parties, thinking about this event, and had a little note on my notepad about asking about faith in politics. And I've come away with, I don't want to overburden the time here, but 2 quick conclusions talking to lawmakers about what really happened with religious voters in the midterm elections. For Republicans, there's a recognition that the Kavanaugh nomination to the Supreme Court affirmed that the courts remain the battlefield now in American politics for religious voters. And what was really interesting to hear from Democrats and Republicans is their new view that the national legislature, the House and the Senate, are no longer really battlegrounds in the same way they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, with the marriage debates, the Defense of Marriage Act, abortion debates. There's a sense that Congress is so divided that it's not going to be an action place for cultural debates, for religious debates, and that the real battles to be fought on issues that matter for religious voters will be in state legislatures that are handling issues like abortion and the scope of abortion law, and the courts. And there's a transactional relationship right now with the Republican Party, President Trump, and conservative religious voters who believe that the state is a threat, that the courts are a threat, and that President Trump may be entirely imperfect for them on moral or ethical grounds, but because he can provide justices like Kavanaugh or Neil Gorsuch onto the Supreme Court, then he is acceptable. And so you have the fervor that used to really dominate the Republican Party on religious issues has faded away to this bond, of a transactional bond between this enormous and influential voting bloc and the Republican Party. And Republicans were so happy, and they also really credited religious voters for helping them to keep the U.S. Senate, that you don't win in a lot of these red states in a midterm election unless you really turn out the conservative voter. And the conservative voter was encouraged in many respects by President Trump talking about immigration. But if you listen to all of President Trump's rallies in the closing couple of months, it was immigration and the caravan, and then it was the court. It was the court. It was a signal to religious voters, we're with you on this issue. He wasn't talking about the tax cut, it was immigration and the court. Second quick point, Democrats have watched all of this. And the real big takeaway for the Democrats with religious voters is there's an opportunity here. Did the Republicans seize the moment and get a lot of them galvanized for Republicans in 2018? Yes, they did. But when I'm talking to Democratic strategists who are thinking through the 2020 presidential race, they think that the biggest opportunity is in front of them in 2020, perhaps the biggest opportunity since 1976, when Jimmy Carter really excited evangelical voters across the country, some even conservative Catholics, and brought them into the Democratic fold. Why do they see it that way? Because they see it's transactional, just like the Republicans see it's transactional. And they think if it's transactional now between many religious voters and the GOP, then that bond is not that strong. And that maybe in the age of Francis, in the age of the Democratic Party connecting more with progressive Catholics, think about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the new congresswoman from New York, writing an article for America magazine recently about her faith. They think Jimmy Carter in 1976, running as an evangelical, running as an outsider, broke in Washington, I will never lie to you. They're tempted now to make a new play. If abortion's not the issue that's really at the fore, maybe it can be about winning over Catholic voters disgruntled about the Republican turn. Maybe there's an opportunity there in 2020. So I'm going to be paying close attention to how Democrats in 2019, as they go to Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, are talking to religious voters. Do they see an opportunity there beyond abortion, beyond the courts, to make a pitch?
Elizabeth, you traveled the country. Every time I tried to find you to invite you to this, you were in a different city. So what's your most important takeaway and most surprising thought?
Thank you for finally getting me here, John. It's always great to be at Georgetown and with you all. Yes, I was spending a lot of time with voters, especially conservative voters. I was in about 12 states, many battlegrounds, House and Senate races, and I heard from a lot of white evangelical and Catholic voters. I think what happened, I mean, as we're talking about what happened with conservative religious voters, what also happened was the Democrats really turned out this cycle, right? And the difference here is that then white social conservatives really turned out, which gave them the ability to hold the Senate. And then when Democrats kept the House, we're left with these like very divergent and increasingly extreme visions. I don't need to keep telling you everything you already know about that, and how we hear that every day. But the power of the white social conservative voting bloc specifically to achieve its ends is, it's been increasingly remarkable to me, right? Because they, as much as Democrats were celebrating this as a blue wave that only strengthened a week after the initial election night results came through, all the sources I was talking to and voters I would call in states, even where Democrats picked up House seats, they were all celebrating because holding the Senate allows them to advance their long-term judicial plan, and they have their eyes on potentially a third Supreme Court justice, right? So in places like Iowa, where Republicans kept the governorship and kept the legislature, even though the 2 House seats flipped to Democrat, they're thinking, okay, but if we want to continue to restrict abortion rights, we can do this with what we have. And so this is part of a long-term plan and vision. I think what I was paying attention to the most was actually the questions within religious communities. And even though we like to paint in these big, broad swaths of what's happening and the more macro trends, the inner questioning and moral wrestling, often just at the edges, but that was much more open than I found even just 2 years ago. And the difference being that now, I mean, I was talking with women, non-white evangelical voters, young voters, and I would hear this story anecdotally no matter where I went, that they'd been lifelong Republican voters, and this time they were so fed up that they were actually going to vote for a Democrat. So I was hearing that in places like Texas and then in Florida and in Georgia. And what was interesting, I mean, even in those places, Republican is still very red, right, in all of those places, even though there was so much energy and fervor that, oh my goodness, maybe something could change and these places could go blue. The kind of creep and the bonds that people were starting to form new communities with one another around these ideas was really interesting. So I'll certainly be continuing to watch that in 2020. And I'm maybe a little bit more skeptical than you are about Democrats. I think that the strategists see that this is an opportunity, and I've certainly heard that from some of them, and we could see a little bit of testing the waters of that this time, with the D-trips admitting at times like, okay, we know that abortion is an issue, we know that we need to reach out to these voters, but it's going to be a very big lift to see what kind of structures Democrats are willing to act, like where are they going to put their money and their resources to this idea. So I think that's going to be really interesting to watch.
And I said earlier that often when people talk about religious voters, they're talking about white evangelicals and white Catholics. And part of the reason we look to Pew and to you is to help us understand how inadequate that analysis is. There was a lot of talk before the election about the importance of the Latino community, about turnout, about their impact. Tell us what actually happened, because lots of people have been pontificating about this.
Sure. So the Latino community, first of all, is the largest minority group in the U.S. They tilt more Catholic. About 46% of the registered voters, of the Hispanic registered voters, are Catholic, and about 20% are evangelical, according to our own surveys. In the run-up to the election, we saw an increased engagement in the election. So there has always been a lot of attention to this population because of their increased numbers. Every year, every election year, we see a record number of Latinos who are eligible to vote, and also a record number who come out and vote. And certainly we saw this time around. Although in the overall, when you see how many people are eligible to vote in elections and how many people actually cast a ballot during election, Latinos typically come short, and there's a big gap in turnout rate between other voters and Latino voters. So this time around, we were really looking to try to see if from exit polls we could actually see how they did, because in midterm elections, last midterm elections in 2014, only 27% of those who were eligible to vote actually casted a ballot. So that is very low. It's only comparable to Asian Americans. Asian Americans are another group that are also not as engaged in politics. And this time around, we don't have final data, but what we have seen from exit polls so far is that they made up about 11% of the voting bloc, which is very similar to what they make up as a population, as a total voting population, which means that we not only will probably have seen a record number, but maybe also an increase in the turnout rate this time around.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Greg, you have been watching this a long time. You're sort of the go-to guy. What surprised you, and what was the most important thing that we're likely to overlook?
Yeah, well, you know, at Pew Research Center, most of our work, most of our research is data-based. Dan and I both spend a lot of time looking at numbers from exit polls, from our own surveys that we conduct at Pew Research Center, to demographic data collected by the Census Bureau and other organizations. So what I see when I look at the data, what I'm struck by is this. You know, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about change. Of course, the election of Donald Trump as president in 2016 was unprecedented in many ways. A few weeks ago in 2018, we saw more change. Whether you think of it as a blue wave or not, the fact is that control of the House of Representatives switched. So there's a lot of change in the atmosphere. But if you look at the data, if you look at how religious groups vote, I'm struck by the continuity. The religious groups in the United States who have tended in recent years to vote for Republican candidates have continued to vote for Republican candidates in 2016 and then again in 2018. Among white evangelical voters 2 weeks ago, about 3/4 voted for the Republican candidate for Congress in their House district. That is basically unchanged over the last decade or so. At the other end of the spectrum, religious voters or religious groups that have tended to support Democratic candidates have continued to support Democratic candidates. Here I'm thinking especially of religious nuns. That's N-O-N-E-S, as John mentioned. These are people who, when asked about their religion, they describe themselves as atheists or as agnostics or as simply nothing in particular with respect to religion. That has long been a strongly Democratic group, and in this year's midterms, 7 in 10 religious nuns backed Democratic candidates for Congress. Jewish voters also continue to vote Democratic in overwhelming margins. Something like 8 in 10 Jewish voters 2 weeks ago voted for Democratic candidates. So there is a lot of continuity despite this atmosphere of change in the American religious and political landscape. Now, not everything is unchanged. We did see some important changes. One of those has to do with Catholics. Catholics in the 2018 midterm election were split right down the middle. Half of Catholic voters supported the Democratic candidate in their district. The other half voted for Republicans. In the last 2 midterm elections, by contrast, in 2014 and 2010, Catholic voters have favored the Republican candidate over the Democratic candidate by about 10 percentage points. So that's a change. We saw a real noticeable change in the voting decisions of American Catholics. One other change that jumped out at me was a little surprising to me, given the stability that we've seen in recent elections, has to do with the share of voters who are religious nuns. The share of voters who say they have no religion jumped 5 points in this midterm election relative to the last midterm election. And analysts, observers have been waiting to see when religious nuns would begin to grow noticeably as a share of voters in the way that we have seen among the general population. For years and years, we've known that non-religious people are growing as a share of Americans as a whole, but their growth as a share of voters has been much slower. Well, it looks like that may be beginning to change with the 2018 midterm. So those are the things that jumped out at me.
What I'm going to do now is to try and ask each of our panelists a question on an area of expertise they have, then maybe spend some time together talking over that, and then turn to you for some questions. And I'm going to begin with Greg. Greg, you are not only the Associate Director of Research for a big research institute, your daughter was confirmed last Friday.
On Friday.
So you're the Catholic in the pew tonight.
Right. It's a big day for us, yeah.
Greg was a part of our polarization conference last June, and he and a couple other people gave us a wonderful presentation based on Pew's data on what unites and divides Catholics. And as I recall, the three things that unite Catholics were concern for the poor, the Eucharist, and Pope Francis, which is good because those are sort of the core of Catholic teaching. At another panel, you can talk about what divides us. But my question is, let's talk about that 10%, that shift you described. What's going on in the Catholic community, and specifically, what are some of the divisions within the Catholic community based on ethnicity, race,
yes.
Age, and other dynamics?
Yes, well, you mentioned that when I was here before, we talked some about our data about Catholics' attitudes about Pope Francis, and just as a teaser, the Catholics' attitudes about Pope Francis have changed a lot since I was last here.
We've heard a little bit about that the last few weeks.
Yes, so maybe we'll get to that later, but if not, just mention that as an aside. If you look at Catholic voters as a whole, what you see is that they are evenly divided, and that in any given election, they can swing back and forth. Sometimes they tend to support Democratic candidates, whether for Congress or the presidency, by narrow margins. Other times they've tended to vote for Republican candidates. That's what you see on the surface. But if you dig just below the surface, what you see is that the Catholic population in the United States is really politically polarized along racial and ethnic lines. If you look at white Catholics, they have been trending for a long time now in a Republican direction. As recently as 2008, the Democratic Party actually had an advantage among white Catholics by about 8 percentage points. The share of white Catholics who identified with or leaned toward the Democratic Party exceeded the share who identify with the Republican Party by about 8 points as recently as 2008. Over the last decade or so, those numbers have steadily changed, and the share of white Catholics who identify as Republicans has grown, while the share of white Catholics who identify as Democrats has shrunk correspondingly. In our most recent data, among white Catholics, Republicans actually outnumber Democrats by something like 14 percentage points. So that's a very noticeable, very strong, very significant trend. Among Latino Catholics, in stark contrast, what we see is a strongly Democratic constituency. Latinos currently make up more than 1/3 of all Catholic adults in the United States. They are growing very rapidly, and that is likely to continue into the future. And politically speaking, Latino Catholics are one of the most consistently and strongly Democratic constituencies in the population. In our most recent data, something like 2/3 of Hispanic Catholics identify with or lean toward the Democratic Party. Far fewer prefer the Republican Party. So what you see among Catholics, if you look at the picture as a whole, is you see a closely divided population. But if you scratch just below the surface, what you actually see are two poles, two camps. One trending strongly in a Republican direction, another large and significant minority population of Latino Catholics that's growing very rapidly, and one of the most consistently democratic groups in the population.
You wrote a book a while ago. I'm trying to remember the name. It was Politics in the Parish, the Political Influence of Catholic Priests. With those kind of divergences, it's going to be very interesting to be a pastor in Catholic parish.
Absolutely. And you know, pastors around the country face very diverse populations in the pews. I think of my own parish here in Fairfax. It's a very diverse population. Many white Catholics, but also a large Latino population, as well as representation of many other racial and ethnic minority groups. So it'll be interesting to see how priests and pastors, to say nothing of bishops, kind of navigate these waters moving forward for the church.
We have a parish like that. I remember coming out of Mass one weekend, and some old Anglo like me was complaining, and it's always about Mass times in the parking lot. And what's happening to our parish? And I said, it's being renewed. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, it's very simple. We do funerals, they do baptisms. Two things I was supposed to say at the beginning and didn't. First, welcome to our friends from C-SPAN and people around the country. This is being broadcast live by C-SPAN. And if you want to join the conversation, you should use the hashtag Faithful Midterms at Catholic Social Teaching at Georgetown. So let me continue with the focus on Latinos. Anna, you have done a lot. Your education has been at the University of Chicago. You have written some of the major studies for Pew. You have a daughter, 24 months old?
23.
23. Those numbers are very important. That's one of the baptisms we were talking about. A couple of things in the studies that you did really struck me. One is about half of Hispanics say their situation has worsened in this country. 49% worry about their place in the United States. And more than half either think they might be deported or know someone who's going to be deported. In terms of their faith and their politics, what does that do in terms of their participation, their willingness to register, to vote if they're afraid of deportation, and the choices they make as a candidate when they feel less welcome, less at home than they have?
Sure, definitely. So one thing that's very important about Latino voters that a lot of people don't think much about is that, yes, 2/3 or about are lean towards the Democratic Party, but they're not a monolithic group. There's a big minority that is Republican, and they are strong Republicans. So in our latest survey, National Survey of Latinos, we found that there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the current situation. A lot more people were saying that they were worried about the situation of Latinos and that it had worsened compared to last year. And actually, those feelings only mirrored the same feelings that they had in 2008 in the middle of the recession. So Latinos are really, really having a hard time right now. And that possibly led into the greater engagement that we saw before this midterm. However, the intent to vote remained mostly the same. And when we saw the exit polls among Hispanics, we saw that almost 70% of them voted Democratic, but almost 30% voted Republican. And this is very similar to the vote that we saw in the last presidential election, how it broke. So it's actually very consistent. So they feel that they are not in a good situation, and they are more enthusiastic about voting, but both sides in the partisan line are enthusiastic. And both sides are engaged and came out and voted almost in the same partisan lines as they have before.
This may be a question that you can't answer given your researcher's hat, but it seems to me, and let me just say it, that Republicans say at least some Republicans, including one in the White House. We wish you weren't here, but since you are, why don't you vote for us? And Democrats seem to say, you are here and you have no place else to go, you ought to vote for us. Why is there so little focus? You wrote an article, The Awakening Giant, Hispanic electorate is likely to double in 2030. We're at a lot of focus on suburban white women. We have a lot of discussion about working class voters. We get relatively little real focus on Latino voters. Why?
So one of the reasons is, as I was mentioning earlier, their turnout rates. Their turnout rates have been low. So when we wrote that article that you were mentioning, it was right after the 2012 election, when actually there seemed to be a lot more engagement among the Latino voters. But after that, in 2014, it was actually a record low turnout in voting. And 2016 did not do as well either. It was, for some people, it was probably disappointing to see. But also, Latinos have other characteristics. So they're very young. Young people tend to vote less and engage less in politics. So someday there will be a lot more participating probably in the elections. But right now, almost half of them are millennial or younger. Or actually, no, half of them are millennial, and about a third are younger than millennial. So it's a very young population. 2/3 of them are under 35 years old right now. The other thing is where they live. So there are very big chunks of Hispanics that are in California, are in Texas. There are also very significant numbers down in Florida. So on presidential elections, they tend to come up as very important, particularly in battleground states, for example, Florida. This time around, they made an important share in some of the states where there was a battleground Senate contest, for example, in Arizona, in Florida. But because they are seen as monolithic sometimes, I think that might lead also to people not maybe focusing as much in them.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Bob. Robert.
If you think about the political map for 2018, based on all those great points, Republicans really wonder if they are actually paying a political cost for President Trump's rhetoric on immigration. And I had a conversation with a smart Democratic senator this week named Brian Schatz from Hawaii. And he said inside of the Democratic cloakroom, the view on immigration and Hispanic voters is the further you get from the U.S.-Mexico border, the more emotional and charged and powerful the immigration issue becomes. You look at the Indiana Senate race. Joe Donnelly, a Catholic running for re-election this year, ran so far to the right on immigration, he actually produced an ad saying, "I can't wait to build President Trump's border wall." This is in Indiana. But you then look at that, and he didn't win. It wasn't enough. But he went far to the right in immigration because President Trump was revving up the Indiana conservative voter on that issue. But you look at the border states, and Republicans feel good about keeping the Senate, but there's a lot of problems for them if you look at what happened along the border. Dean Heller goes down, a Republican in Nevada. Jackie Rosen, a Democrat, wins. In Arizona, Kristen Sinema, who's one of the nuns, she's one of the first atheists to be elected to the, not religious, to be elected to the U.S. Senate. She wins in Arizona, beats out Martha McSally. California, of course, goes Democrat. Beto O'Rourke doesn't win, but very competitive in Texas. And the underreported part of what happened in Florida, Republicans feel good about Florida, but the Hispanic vote was highly energized in Florida. What happened in Florida? It's the voter we were just talking about, that white, ethnic, Catholic voter who was a Reagan Democrat and has become Republican. Guess where they're all moving? Florida. So the Hispanic vote in population is actually growing in Florida, but so is the population of white retirees who are Republican. So the Democrats are struggling with that whole dynamic, even as they're really getting the Democratic vote out in Florida. So if you think about Florida, Texas, Arizona, California, Nevada, Democrats have to feel pretty good about the Hispanic vote, the religious vote, the Catholic Hispanic voter, because they are coming out. And President Trump going after the caravan, the border wall, it has a benefit politically now. It kept him the Senate in some respects. But Republicans are very concerned when you talk to them this week on Capitol Hill. What is the real price we pay in 20 when the real turnout happens for the Democrats? I wrote a story for tomorrow's Washington Post about President Trump. He brought the Republican voter up, but 2020, that is the Democratic turnout year. And if they're even more energized than they are now, and you look especially in those states, they certainly were energized in 2018. And Florida is going to be taken as a GOP win, but look at the data in Florida, and you see Republicans have to count on that white retiree to keep coming out in the same numbers in Florida, but the Hispanic population is expected to keep growing. And it's a fascinating story because Republicans, the real debate on immigration may be 2 years from now, 5 years from now, not just in this immediate moment.
Bob wrote it. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Florida is actually a very special case because for a long time the Hispanic population there has been predominantly Cuban and more Republican than not. However, that is changing. Hispanic population voters there are becoming more independent and also democratic. So the registration of Republicans has just stayed very stable in the last 4 years, for example, while the registration among Democrats and independents has really risen among Hispanics. So this is also a changing population there, and unfortunately might be undercounted because of all these other populations that are also growing there right now.
Yeah. But Robert talked about the story he is writing for tomorrow. You wrote a story either yesterday or today. I read the paper at night, and I never know which thing, but it was on evangelicals, sort of taking a look at at what happened and their sense of satisfaction and unease. You come with a remarkable background. You're a graduate of Wheaton, Princeton theology. I love the story. You started as an intern at Time magazine, and you wrote the cover story on Pope Francis, and then you go to the New York Times. You've gotten lots of awards, but the most important award is the Hunt Award from America Magazine for outstanding religion reporting, selected by Jesuits. And what they said was a combination of emotional generosity, deep curiosity, intellectual confidence, and clear vision. And there is a whole generation of young religion reporters that Elizabeth is a leader in. But we are really at a good moment, and at a time when there's disinvestment in a lot of journalism, we're really blessed to have a group, and Elizabeth is key to that. And the example, we talked a lot about the sexual abuse crisis. If you have not read the story that Elizabeth wrote about a parish in Pennsylvania that discovered their beloved pastor on the list, it just shows the anguish and the hurt and the harm that's been done. She's not here to talk about that. You have been talking to a lot of evangelicals who feel really good about where they are, who are close to the administration. And you are also talking to a lot of evangelicals that are wondering what they've gotten themselves into, especially women and especially young people. What is going on in the evangelical community? Is there a potential for a fracture?
Yes, there is a lot going on in the evangelical community, and also I think in the kind of counterpart Catholic community that is very similar. We don't have to get into this now, but I was thinking earlier in our conversation about when Pope Francis talked about, was it Spadaro, the Alliance of Hate? Do you remember this, between white evangelicals and white Catholics in the U.S., and how, as we talk about how Catholics are increasingly Republican, and their voting habits look a lot like white evangelicals, that's the dynamic that's going on in our elections here. So I spend a lot of time asking questions of young people, and I think of this group of young women, young moms in the suburbs of Dallas that I spent some time with, and it's hilarious because you think about what are evangelical women doing in a place like Texas, right? This very strong Bible Belt. And you know, the first young mom that I called was absolutely 120 million% for Beto O'Rourke. And she said, "Oh yes, I know, 20 other young women. Absolutely, this is what's this is the conversation going on in all of our churches." And I was fascinated by that. So I went down and talked with them, and they would say things like, "Oh, I want you to talk to my friend so-and-so, but she isn't comfortable because her husband doesn't, want anyone to know that he's actually voting for Cruz, and he doesn't want her to vote for Beto, so she comes over and whispers in my ear, I'm voting for Beto too." And this was just over and over. Then these stories started kind of flooding into my inbox. And I think some of it for them was being a border state. The family separation hit these young moms, in their early 30s, I would say, is the demographic I was really looking at. And they all are young parents themselves, all historically Republican voters. And they were expressing that, now that to even put the Beto O'Rourke sticker on their car and drive it to the church parking lot felt like this huge act of rebellion. But then they would get there, and then they saw another Beto O'Rourke sticker, and then they realized they weren't alone, and they started talking with one another on social media, and they kind of found each other behind the scenes. And that's the kind of conversation that I felt captured. It really just touches a nerve. I mean, you can learn a lot by hearing, like when you're reporting on something, sometimes you'll touch something and then like everything will just explode, and then all these other conversations will spawn all over that you just didn't anticipate, and then you realize, okay, what's going on here that's maybe deeper, more far-reaching than I thought. And the conversation between and amongst young evangelicals and their families was certainly part of that. So we also the Times also did a call out. We asked readers to write to us. We said, if you're a young evangelical millennial, write to us, and we gave them a few questions about faith and politics to answer. And I kid you not, we had 1,500 essays, just really long, thought out essays. These young people really wanted to share. I mean, they felt like there wasn't an outlet for their feelings, and in some cases, feelings of betrayal by their parents' generation and the kind of moral majority faith with which they were raised. And they didn't know what to do about it. And many of them would say, "I've never talked about politics with my parents ever." And they said, "If you print this, my parents are going to find out for the first time that I voted for a Democrat here." So that part of it is really fascinating, and I think, yes, it's true that in Texas, Ted Cruz won, or I think of a young woman I spoke with in an Ohio House district. She's a young evangelical woman voting for a Democrat for the first time, but it's the way that these questions get wrestled out within families, within communities, that I think is instructive for my reporting and how we tried to approach the midterms.
Going to be a lot of interesting Thanksgiving dinners in Texas.
Yes.
Robert, you're known for a lot of things. One of the favorite things I read about you is you brought John Mayer to your high school prom.
That's off topic.
Yeah. Long story. I mean, from that to Washington Week,
Thank you.
Wall Street Journal, National Review, Washington Post, PBS, you've sort of covered it there already in 10 years of journalistic service. You were assigned to Trump when none of us thought that was a great idea.
I wasn't even really assigned to him. I just covered him.
Yeah. Well.
Even my editor said, "What are you doing?"
Yeah. Well, good choice.
We could argue that, right?
President Trump recently, he's not particularly religious. I think he's close to have violated all 10 commandments at this point.
I'm a reporter. I'm not engaging on that. Just right down the center.
He recently said, and I quote, "Nobody's done more for Christians or evangelicals or frankly religion than I have," which leaves Jesus in a distant second, I think. He got 3 out of 4 evangelicals. He gets a majority of white Catholics. How does he pull this off? And what are the stresses and strains that are happening now in terms of his behavior, his policies, his anger, his choice of how to define, going after moderate Republicans, going after generals? How does he position himself? You know him as well as any journalist in the country. How does he see himself working with religious communities? And does he see beyond the evangelical base to the rest of us?
It's a great question. So I've covered President Trump for a long time. And one thing you noticed about President Trump when I first started to cover him back in 2011, 2012, is this was someone who was unlike every other Republican I was covering at that time. Republicans, I would go to the CPAC conservative conference, I'd go to evangelical gatherings, I'd cover it all, the right of the right, what's happening, and you'd have politician after politician come to these confabs, and as the millennials, the students here will understand this term, virtue signal to the evangelical community or to the conservative Catholic community, I'm with you. I speak in your cadence. I speak with your issues. And they thought if they could appeal to religious voters on that level and try to have a visceral connection with them on policy, say the right things, that was the path to victory in the Republican nomination fight. I covered Mike Huckabee's campaign, Rick Santorum for 10 months, Mitt Romney. They all, relatively speaking, took a similar tack in reaching out to religious voters. President Trump, then candidate Trump, and even businessman Trump, Mr. Trump, never really did that. He'd meet with them. He didn't seem that engaged even when they would tell him stories. It was about winning for him. He recognized that religious voters, evangelical voters, at the end of the day, after losing to President Obama in 2008, after watching Huckabee and Santorum and Romney fall in 2012, they didn't want or really necessarily care if the candidates running for the Republican nomination were like them. What they wanted was power. And one thing I've learned as a political reporter is that power unites. Power brings people together in ways that any kind of virtue signaling or characteristic or overture or soundbite can. What did religious voters really want? In a fast-changing culture where the norms of their lives and their faiths were being upended seemingly by the month, by the courts, they didn't care if Senator Cruz was like them and talked like them. Senator Cruz barely wins the Iowa caucuses in early 2016. What they wanted was a winner, someone who could actually take the White House. And so President Trump did enough in the campaign by providing his list of justices that he culled together with the Federalist Society, by putting Mike Pence on the ticket, enough to, in his way, virtue signal that he was with them. But Trump understood then, when he bonded with Pence, I was with him in Indiana, he was never trying to, over the top, say, I'm just like you. They actually liked, you talk to evangelical leaders, religious leaders, they kind of liked that Trump wasn't trying to personally bond with them. Sometimes people would put their hands on his shoulders and do the hands and the prayers. President Trump would just kind of nod. He would never really get into it because he just said to them, I'm going to win. I'm going to win states the others can't. Take a bet on me. His pitch to evangelical voters was the same pitch he made to African American voters. What the heck do you have to lose? Cruz, Huckabee, Santorum, Romney, they all lost. The culture's already gone. He would say, you've already lost most of it, of what you think is your issue, your agenda. Why not take a chance on an outsider? And the outsiders, the religious voters, took a chance on him. And right now, transactionally speaking, they've gotten a lot out of it. They can't maybe tell their children. You meet a lot of them, they say, well, I don't tell my children to follow the moral example of President Trump. But man, they like the court, and they like the Republicans controlling the Senate. And they say, and that's one thing, I always try to listen to people when I'm out on the campaign trail. They say to me back in 2015, 2016, Mr. Washington Post, you don't understand how the cultural upheaval has affected me, and that the change of marriage laws, the courts moving in so many different directions, a lot of religious voters felt upheaval in their lives. And they actually weren't reaching for stability with Secretary Clinton or with a different Republican. They wanted to put a stop to it. And that stop was Donald Trump. As David Brooks says, Mark Shields here, a great man, Mark Shields from PBS. I'm glad he's here. David Brooks often says, his colleague at the NewsHour, Donald Trump was the wrong answer to the right question. And I often think about that for religious voters. They were asking a question of who can really put a stop to the state, put a stop to the culture, try to fight for our issues. And they may have gotten the wrong answer personally for them, ethically, morally. They don't like his affairs or the alleged affairs. They don't like his alleged actions and statements on different things. They don't like the lies, the controversies. But they've accepted that because Santorum couldn't win. Huckabee couldn't win.
I didn't. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, we conducted a survey in early 2016 in the run-up to the election, and we asked voters all around the country how religious they thought some of the leading presidential candidates were. So we asked, how religious do you think Hillary Clinton is? How religious do you think Bernie Sanders is? On the Republican side, we asked, how religious do you think Donald Trump is? We asked about Ted Cruz, Ben Carson, and Marco Rubio. So 6 people in total. By a wide margin, there were fewer people who said they thought Donald Trump was very or even somewhat religious than said the same about any other candidate, including Bernie Sanders. But what you saw among Republicans, including religious Republicans, is that they thought Donald Trump would make for a good or an excellent president, even though they did not think he was particularly religious. So you're exactly right. They did not, evangelical voters, Republican voters, did not necessarily view Donald Trump as sharing their religious faith and convictions and values, but they voted for him nevertheless because they thought he would be a good president anyway. So what the account you just described is backed up in the data, no question about that.
2 points, one question and 1 point before we go to your questions. First of all, I didn't acknowledge that Robert is a product of Notre Dame. I think we should.
Notre Dame gets an applause at Georgetown. I'm going to send a note to Father Jenkins and tell him about this.
I would point out that Robert is such a domer that he served on the board of Notre Dame
I did
University.
not pay him to say all this stuff.
Yeah? Just wait.
Sounds like my mom.
Since he's left the board, since Robert left the board, the Irish football team has
I can't take credit for
much, much, much better. So,
oh, that's true. That is true.
For many of us, the definition of religious voter is too narrow. Our faith compels us to defend immigrants when they're demonized, to lift up the poor when they're oppressed, to work for peace in a conflicted world. If your definition of religious voters is more Pope Francis and less Ralph Reed, what do we need to do in this context to make the case for human life and dignity, for respect for the unborn and the undocumented, for making the poor and immigrants and refugees welcome here in our country?
Well, I can't suggest strategies for.
Well, sure, you could. It's only C-SPAN.
Right. I don't have strategies to pursue particular ends, but there is one thing that I think is worth mentioning, that I think is worth religious people of all kinds worth realizing, and that is this: the United States is politically polarized, not just as a population as a whole, The religious groups that constitute the United States population are themselves deeply politically polarized. Let me give you just a couple of examples. Among Catholic Republicans, who account for something like half of all Catholics, 6 in 10 say that they believe that poor people in the United States today have it easy because they can get government benefits without doing anything in return. And 2/3 of them say that they think that governmental aid to the poor does more harm than good. Okay? So these are Catholics. They're Catholic Republicans whose political opinions, whose attitudes, you could argue, run contrary to the social teachings of the church. We see the exact same thing on the other side when it comes to abortion. 7 in 10 Catholic Democrats say they think that abortion should be legal in most or all cases. They do not agree with the church's teachings on that issue. And you see this on issue after issue after issue, whether we're talking about the environment, whether we're talking about immigration, and we see it not just for Catholics. We see it within every religious community that we're able to examine in the data. You see it among evangelicals. You see it among mainline Protestants. So religious communities are themselves deeply polarized. And so, as I mentioned, I can't suggest a strategy for pursuing a particular policy goal. I do think that if religious communities are to discuss these issues in a productive way, just kind of realizing that they're coming from different points of view, even from people who are sharing the same pew, that at least might be the starting point for a conversation.
It seems the case that for a lot of us, our politics shapes our faith instead of the other way around. If not advice, what context, how do we take these principles and put them to work in a polarized political environment, a new Congress that's coming to town?
I don't want to take, okay, I'll take it.
Take it.
I've been doing a lot of listening to speeches of Robert Kennedy this month. He would have been 93 years old on November 25th. You think he's actually younger than President Jimmy Carter, if you can imagine that. He'd be 93 on November 25th if he was still alive. 50 years ago, he got killed in California. Bobby Kennedy in '68 campaign, if you read a lot about it, he really revived the Democratic Party on poverty in reaching out, his famous trips to West Virginia and to Appalachia. And you think about what's the main bipartisan issue right now in the United States. What's the one thing that got done in Congress this month and was signed by President Trump? Opioids, the opioid epidemic. That places in this country that are struggling with poverty and drug abuse, that is really an issue where if you're going to run for president in 2020, you have to be able to speak to that. And that I really think about religious voters as a reporter, it's not just about talking about the culture, because so often we get it sucked into, reporters too. It's abortion, it's the culture, those are the issues, these highly charged, very kind of big picture cultural battleground. But there's also the human side of faith. And as you were saying, where does the Francis voter go? Maybe look at Robert Francis Kennedy's example. And if you're a Republican too, Paul Ryan tried as the House Speaker. He used to talk about poverty, but there wasn't a huge appetite in the House GOP and a conservative party to move on a lot of the poverty programs. But Ryan recognized the Republican Party had a deficit on that front. He went around the country with a gentleman named Bob Woodson, a longtime religious organizer. He was started out liberal, now he's more conservative, African-American gentleman. And Ryan tried to build a relationship with him to show to the country that he was working on poverty. Never really clicked for different reasons. But poverty issues, you talk about immigration, we talk about abortion, but where's the real conversation in this country on poverty? It's happening at one level with opioids and health care, but that's really the challenge. How do you, you read books like J.D. Vance, you read books like Charles Murray Coming Apart, you just read reported in the New York Times and Washington Post. Cross-demographic groups in this country, there's a fraying of families in white communities, African-American communities, Hispanic communities. Hispanic communities actually doing pretty better as a whole on some of those issues. But there's this total fraying in this country, and unwinding, as George Packer often talks about in The New Yorker. And speaking to that national unwinding, the coming apart at the seams of the norms and the values that used to unite this country, not just on democratic level, but on religious and personal level, I think is really the way, when I listen to politicians and I hear the passion of a Beto O'Rourke or Stacey Abrams or even a Paul Ryan on the Republican side talk about poverty, they're really trying to speak to that. And that's the politician, I think, post-Trump. If there is going to be a different kind of politician who's not a celebrity, not a populist that breaks through, they're going to have some passion at that human level to speak to voters, so it's not just a suggestion that they're going to win you back on abortion or the marriage issue. Can you win those voters over on a different conversation?
It seems like a long time ago, but it was less than 5 years that our initiative had on this stage President Barack Obama, Robert Putnam, and Arthur Brooks talking about how people could work across partisan and ideological lines. How you study immigration a lot. You break through some of the myths. One of the studies I saw, more Mexicans leave this country than come into this country. What is the context for people who want to welcome immigrants, defend their dignity? Based on your data, what should we know and understand, and what should we avoid?
In the overall population or among Hispanics only?
Among the whole population.
Okay, so we've seen in the overall population that the opinions about immigrants have actually become more positive across the years, since we have data since the mid-90s. So attitudes became less positive about immigrants and have recently risen as more positive, but this is very partisan, very polarized opinions. So people who align themselves with the Democratic Party are more likely to hold opinions that are positive towards immigrants, that are favorable, who support policies that are favorable towards immigrants. For example, DACA, the relief for children, people who came here as children, or are very against border wall. And people who align themselves with the Republican Party, particularly those who are on the conservative spectrum of the Republican Party, are more likely to be against immigration in general. And that's actually a polarization that we even see among Latino voters as well. So Latino voters who align themselves with the Democratic Party also hold views that are more favorable towards immigration, and those who align themselves with the Republican Party are more likely to be less favorable towards immigration.
As I ask Elizabeth to weigh in on this, I invite you to come to the microphone if you have a question. Elizabeth, you cross a lot of lines. You talked about the conversations you have had with evangelicals. You know the Catholic community really well. In this context, how do we make the case for human life and dignity in a polarized church, in a polarized country? How do we build some of the bridges you were talking about?
I'll have to let you answer how to build them, and let me know when you do. But I'm watching how that conversation plays out, especially on race. Sometimes I've wondered, when I'm a little bit more cynical maybe in my reporting, I've wondered, how much of an influence religion really is when it comes to people's political choices, and how much of it is really embedded in people's racial identities and backgrounds. And so I'm curious, going forward into 2020, how those lines get hardened for white evangelicals, especially, and white Catholics, and where, if any place, there will be those new even just openness to having that conversation and identifying, this is about our whiteness, for example. If ever anyone in a religious community is talking about that and what it means for their politics, that's something that I'll really be watching for.
Could I follow up?
Sure.
So just to follow up on that, I agree wholeheartedly. It's impossible to escape race and ethnicity when you're talking about American politics, even when you're talking about religion and politics. We've talked a lot tonight about white evangelicals and about the differences between white Catholics and Latino Catholics. And there's a good reason for that. The reason for that is that the religious divides that we see in the United States, the religiously based political divides that we see in the United States, really are concentrated among white voters. That is to say, you know, we hear a lot of discussion about how more religious people tend to be more Republican and less religious people tend to be more Democratic. And that's absolutely true in the aggregate. But that relationship really only exists among white voters. If you look at African American voters, if you look at Latino voters, if you look at voters from other racial and ethnic minority backgrounds, they tend to be both deeply religious. In their religious beliefs and practices, they have a lot in common with their white evangelical counterparts. Racial and ethnic minorities tend to be deeply religious and strongly democratic in the way that they approach politics. And that's why when you talk about these things, you kind of have to talk separately about whites and African Americans and Latinos. Religiously, white evangelicals, deeply religious white Catholics have a lot in common with many racial and ethnic minorities. Politically, they couldn't be further apart. They're really the political, at opposite ends of the political spectrum. So that's, I agree wholeheartedly, and I also think it's important to provide that context about why this conversation kind of takes the shape that it does.
Sure. Let's go to the folks who've been waiting patiently. We have a lot of people lined up. Let's do 2 questions at a time, and we'll ask the panel to respond, and please put your question in the form of a question.
As Georgetown faculty, as a Latina, as a mentor to many disadvantaged students here in Georgetown, and as an immigrant, my husband and I became very involved during the past election, and we were on the ground a lot. And one thing we saw when conversing with people in the Shenandoah Mountains, whether they're white or black or Latinos, was the same. For instance, when Latinos feel alienated, when they tell you again and again that you don't belong, that you're taking somebody else's job, they feel it and they retreat from the democratic process, as Jose Antonio Vargas said. And so with this past election, what lost was the idea of America, and what won was the cowardice of the progressives, the Democratic Party, not the progressives. We need to, while the Republican Party invented an idea of immigration is the scourge, the Democrats said, let's just stick to healthcare. They're so afraid to be genuine, so afraid to embrace the idea of America, that that's what's going to make them lose again if they continue to be this scared. Like you said, you gotta be genuine. That's why Beto O'Rourke was very appealing to many people, because he would tackle any subject. And we had a lot of interesting conversations. We spoke with evangelical Republican Latinos, had conversations with them, deep conversations, and they changed their vote. We were invited into the house of an ex-felon in Virginia who was voting for the first time, and spent an hour with this person. We spoke with blacks who had never registered to vote in the Shenandoah Mountains because they don't think they're going to count. And so how can we get the Democratic Party to understand this? Okay. To understand that it's more than just healthcare.
Yep. DACA disappeared during the campaign. Thank you very much for your eloquent appeal. Identify yourself and ask a question.
Hi there. My name is Brendan Johnson. I'm a native of Metro Detroit. I'm a first-year grad student in the Master of Science in Foreign Service program here at Georgetown, and I appreciate you all for coming very much. I have 2 small questions, but they are both inspired by our panelists from the Pew Research Center, but if journalists have an interesting perspective on them, I would love to hear your opinions too.
Sure. Fire away.
The first one, Greg, you had mentioned the growing polarization within Catholics, white Catholics leaning right and Latino Catholics leaning left. I'm wondering, I'm a young white Catholic, I have lots of young white Catholic friends, and they do not tend to lean white. So I'm wondering if you could stratify that with age, if there is a stratification to be made. And then Anna, talking about low turnout rates for Hispanics, I am curious if there's lingual disenfranchisement and to what extent language is a prohibitive barrier to Hispanic participation in the democratic process. Thanks.
Okay. So 2 questions to our researchers, and can the Democrats find the courage of their convictions?
You guys go first.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should I take the
either one.
So great questions. Let me point out a couple of things. Number one is, while it is true that white Catholics have been trending in a Republican direction over the last decade or so, and that Republicans now hold an advantage among that group, we have to keep in mind that there's diversity within every single religious tradition in the United States. Most white Catholics today identify with or lean toward the Republican Party, but there's a significant minority who continue to favor the Democratic Party. So I'm not at all surprised that you've got friends and colleagues and who are Catholic.
And what are those numbers, Greg? It's like 60-40, 55-45?
In our most recent data, which is from last year, 54% of white Catholics identified with or leaned toward the Republican Party, 40% identified with or leaned toward the Democratic Party, with the remainder independent and not leaning toward either party.
Okay.
One interesting piece of data, we actually have looked at this by age. And you know what's super interesting is that young people within a variety of religious traditions are distinctive in some ways. They're more politically liberal than their elders in some ways, especially on issues having to do with sexuality and homosexuality in particular. But that pattern does not hold true whatsoever with respect to partisanship. Whether you're looking at white Catholics or white evangelicals or white mainline Protestants, young people, young adults, those in their late teens and 20s, are just as Republican as are their elders. So it is not the case that there's a political trend leftward among any religious group in the United States that's being driven by young people. They tend to be just as Republican as their elders.
Anna, before I ask you, I'll remind you, if you want to join our conversation, the hashtag is FaithfulMidterms.
Yeah, so about the lingual disenfranchisement. So when we have asked, for example, Latinos who say, I do not plan to vote in incoming elections, we did this in 2016, we asked them a follow-up question, why? Why don't you plan on voting? And actually, it was more likely that they would say that they did not like any of the candidates, or that they were not interested or not following the election, for example, rather than something to do with barriers or it being too difficult or something like that. When you also look at how census measures this after the fact, people are more likely to say that they didn't get the time, that they were busy or something like this. However, there are certainly barriers to, in some states, to minority groups in terms of access to voting. But in terms of the Hispanic population per se, those who are eligible to vote are mostly US born, and US born Latinos typically are proficient in English. And that's something that we've seen in the Hispanic population across all our surveys, is that immigrants are predominantly Spanish reliant, but then their children are majority, or almost all of them, are proficient in English, and actually a chunk of them only speak English, are no longer bilingual. And by the third generation or more, so people who do not have an immigrant parent, Latinos are 98% English proficient. They speak very well English.
Any thoughts about, that was more an eloquent appeal than a question, any thoughts about the Democrats getting the courage of their convictions, as I said?
The professor's points were valid and they're reflective of the ongoing debate in the Democratic Party. You have to recognize, perhaps, that the Democratic debate, the Democratic Civil War, which is really undercovered because the Republican Civil War has been the dominant story for the past decade, but the Democratic reckoning about their own future, their own fights, their own values, is really happening now, and it's still being fought. In 2018, it was dominated by the congressional Democrats. You think about the agenda she outlined in healthcare and trade. Democrats thought if they could focus on healthcare in a place like Wisconsin, they could knock off Scott Walker, ran almost entirely against him on pre-existing conditions, they defeat him. Across the industrial Midwest, they run on healthcare and trade. Democrats said, we have passion on immigration. You talk to all the top strategists for the House and the Senate. They said, we have the same passion you have on immigration, but if you really want to take back the Trump state, take back the Trump voter, you have to steal back the issue he stole from the Democrats, trade. So you listen to how Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, Michigan, the Senate candidates all ran healthcare and trade. Okay. Immigration was resisted. Real quick, though, that's going to change. If you're frustrated with the Democratic Party because they went with the congressional Democratic agenda in 2018, that's going to change in 2019, 2020. Because now it's not Schumer and Pelosi who are taking the reins of the Democratic message. It's going to be a battle royale for the Democratic nomination. And there's going to be a real fight to make 2020 a referendum on issues like immigration rather than just put it on the shelf.
Okay. We have lots of people and a little time. Let's take 3 questions at once.
Hi, my name is Caroline Moffat, and I'm an undergraduate student at the School of Foreign Service here. Thank you so much for your time. You've spoken at length about the cross-section between Democratic voters and Catholic voters, specifically on the issue of abortion. But I'd like to ask you a question on the cross-section between Democratic politicians who are also pro-choice. It's been almost 40 years since famously Father Rob Drinan was the congressman from Massachusetts who said while he was morally opposed to abortion, he legally was pro-choice. And I'm wondering why 40 years on, that still seems to be a radical stance for Democratic politicians to take.
Okay, next.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm also an undergraduate here at Georgetown, working on my honors thesis about evangelical political participation. And so I'm focusing a lot on kind of the international and foreign aid side, and I was wondering if you could speak to maybe policies like the Mexico City policy or funding for PEPFAR that are more internationally oriented that you think appeal to religious voters or have an effect on their political participation. Thank you.
Okay. One more?
Hello, I'm Dominic. I work here at the university. A question for the folks from Pew. You shared a lot of interesting statistics about how self-identified religious voters voted in the last election. I was wondering if you have any data on specifically the subset of practicing religious voters, and if that is any different from the broader trends of merely those who identify as having a religion. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. I'll try and respond quickly to the question about international assistance. One of the last bipartisan issues in this Congress and in this country, it's surprising to most people, is Republican-Democratic support for PEPFAR, for healthcare abroad, for aid to poor families around the world, and that is primarily as a result of a decade of work of the religious community working with Republicans, CRS taking members of Congress to Africa, evangelicals making the case that feeding the hungry is an obligation of faith. That actually is a model of how we might be able to impact things in the future, but it is one area where you would have thought it impossible, foreign aid, for heaven's sakes, where you get strong bipartisan support. Trump proposed zeroing out all those accounts almost, and it went nowhere. So how about the others? The Democratic Party and abortion, and practicing Catholics and politics.
Right. On the Democratic Party and abortion, that is a question that you're certainly not alone in asking. Goodness, I'm trying to think. There's a small number of Democratic candidates who were more careful about that line in the last couple of years and more willing to make that kind of public declaration, even though it goes completely against the party, despite the fact that Nancy Pelosi has said the party needs to be more welcoming to pro-life voters. But structurally, that's been very difficult to carry out. I think it's been complicated for Democrats this cycle, especially because it's because of the year of the woman, and that's mostly been the year of the Democratic woman, and the way that abortion rights is tied to the women's rights movement, and how things then played out with Kavanaugh. I mean, it's this very complicated web. But I can tell you that on the ground, when I talk to voters in ad nauseum states, they would say goodness, if there was only a Democratic candidate who was much more vocally opposed to abortion, I would be there. Like, you would have my support and I'd bring all these people with me. But it seems to me to be more one of those things that Democratic politicians like to give ear service to when they realize that it's a problem, but structurally it doesn't change anything in terms of the policies they support. And someone asked about the Mexico City policy. Evangelicals and Catholics are very happy with the Mexico City policy, so it's another checkpoint for them in their list of why Trump is making them all winners.
Practicing Catholics?
Yeah, well, again, you have to think about this. You have to look separately at Latino Catholics and others. But if we look at white Catholics specifically, we see that those who are most religiously observant, those who say they attend Mass on a weekly basis, tend to be more strongly Republican than those who are not quite so religiously observant. You see the same pattern with respect to white evangelicals. You know, there's a lot of discussion over the last few years about religious voters' support for Trump, and in particular, you've seen people make the argument, or wonder, maybe that's a better word, you've seen people wonder whether white evangelicals and white Catholics who support Donald Trump are actually the less observant among them, maybe they're less serious, maybe they're less devout in their practice of the faith. Not true. Among both groups, white evangelicals and white Catholics, those who attend religious services most often, those who are most serious in their practice of the faith, are as supportive of Donald Trump, if not more supportive of Donald Trump, than are those who are less religiously observant.
We have 4 people left and no time left, so let's take your 4 questions and we'll use that for the conclusion.
My name is Neil Bliven. I'm involved with fundraising for the university's Cancer Research Center. Would you discuss the idea that an authoritarian perspective rather than an evangelical perspective is the explanatory factor in voting, and also parse out the differences between Pentecostals and charismatics and dispensationalists or mainline church members concerning how they voted, including in the Latino community?
Boy, those are some subgroups.
Hi, I'm David Jimenez. I'm at a think tank here in DC. My question is, we're witnessing in the Democratic Party both the ascendancy of African American and Latino voters on the one hand, and more vocal white liberal activists and donors. Do you think there could eventually be some kind of tension between those two camps, especially since the former is actually more to the center both on economics, culture, and certainly religion in the public square?
Kate Clinton, Georgetown graduate. When Melania Trump met Pope Francis, she was proud to say, "I will be the second woman Catholic in the White House as First Lady." Vice President Pence was raised a Catholic. Steve Bannon, the former employee of the White House, has a Georgetown degree. Kellyanne Conway is a practicing Catholic. How do you reconcile all of these disparate samples of White House leaders with our Catholic tradition?
Hey, Jim.
Hello, John.
Take all the time you...
All right, thank you very much.
Yeah. No.
My name is Jim London. I've known John since he was Robert's age.
No.
And what I wanted to focus on here was evangelical historian John Fee has written a book recently entitled Believe Me. And what he would say was most impressive to evangelicals was Trump's ability to really galvanize their fearfulness and to get the fear that they had, the fear of the other, and there are a lot of different others that they would have that fear of, that was something that really, really drove his connection with the evangelicals. He did it better than anybody else. Second thing, talking about the fear of the other, I haven't heard much said about what difference 1.4 million formerly incarcerated people in Florida is going to have the next time there's an election in Florida, especially since if you look at the demographics of mass incarceration, a very large percentage of those will be African Americans.
Okay. So take your choice, authoritarian and subgroups in the data. Tension between the affluent element of the Democratic coalition and the people of color part of the Democratic coalition. how did all these people who say they're Catholic end up in this White House? And how does fear for the other shape our politics, and will formerly incarcerated people change the politics of Florida?
I'll take the White House question.
Thank you, Jesus.
It's a provocative question. How do they end up in the White House? How can this happen? How do they still end up in the Catholic Church? They're still Catholic. You want to talk about a civil war in the Republican Party? Follow Steve Bannon in the Catholic Church. He's as vocal and aggressive inside of the Catholic Church, outside of the White House now, fighting Pope Francis globally, going to Italy, talking about Francis and how conservative cardinals should really be running the church. I mean, Bannon's a global figure with this nationalism that's out there fighting Francis tooth and nail. When I mentioned Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her essay she wrote for America Magazine, which is an interesting read, talking about her Catholic faith, when I tweeted that article, I got all these text messages from Catholic leaders in the Congress, sources, who said, how could you tweet that? Don't you know her position on abortion? So hard line, they don't even want to read Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Bannon doesn't even want to talk about Pope Francis as someone who maybe he could learn from or take a lesson from. This is total war, not only for many Republicans, but for many Catholics. And so the conservative Catholic types, those who see Francis as a mistake, not someone to embrace, President Trump is someone who's really in their camp. Again, just like the evangelical leaders saying he's not one of us, but he's an ally. And he's an ally. President Trump is an ally to people like Kellyanne Conway, to people like Steve Bannon. They know President Trump doesn't go to Catholic Church, but they're dismayed in their own way. I don't want to speak for them and their faith, but they've expressed public dismay, Bannon at least has, about the direction of the church. And so we're in a historic moment of total change and total political war inside America, inside the church. And if you just follow these nationalism debates across the world, it really extends to the Catholic Church. There are those like Pope Francis who come out of a certain tradition in his own country and Catholic social teaching. And then there are those like Bannon who want to go back to the old Mass pre-Vatican Council. And that's the war. And it's a war we're going to not have any easy answer to. How do they be there? They're there because they're reflective of who we are, globally as Catholics, Americans.
Thank you. Here's what's left for the rest of you. Authoritarians and subgroups, tension in the Democratic coalition, or fear of the other. For $100, who wants?
I got incarceration in Florida. Well, it's going to be...
That's only $25.
Okay, right. I was talking with one of the organizers for the campaign to pass that measure on the ballot to give the right to vote back to people who had been incarcerated. And one of the things she was mentioning to me was how difficult it was to get white Christian leaders on board with their campaign, whereas they had a lot of partners in the African American community and the Muslim community. The white pastors were basically absent from that whole campaign, even though the majority of the people who are the formerly incarcerated population in Florida is actually white. So it was an interesting point because I think we're going to probably see a lot of tensions and surprises come out of that. I mean, I'm trying to think of the last time a population like that large has suddenly been eligible to vote. It's going to be, and I know other states are going to be watching that as a test case to see sort of what happens, so it's hugely consequential.
Do you want to take the subgroups?
Could I choose a different door?
Yes.
Because truthfully, we don't have a lot of data on this.
That's why I wanted that. That was short.
I do think the question about whether or not there's tension, whether or not there's the possibility or the potential for tension within the Democratic Party between white liberals or even maybe another way to think about it is kind of secular liberals, people who aren't particularly religious, and racial and ethnic minority voters who tend to be deeply religious, I do think that there's a real potential there for tension. I remember going to events at think tanks around town in the aftermath of the 2004 election, after George W. Bush won re-election, and there was a lot of discussion at these events about what can and should the Democratic Party do to reach out to and appeal to religious voters. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, that has the potential risk of alienating this group of non-religious voters, people who are religious nuns, who are strongly democratic and growing in the population. Now, on one level, I guess it's always true that political parties, both parties, have to manage and juggle and reconcile diverse viewpoints and diverse coalitions. So the Democrats certainly aren't alone in that respect, but I do think that that's something to watch, absolutely.
You want to take fear of the other?
One of the items on Pentecostals, I know there's not data for that specifically, but in the 2016 presidential campaign, it was something we were really watching. I mean, so many of the pastors that initially came out in support of then candidate Trump were prosperity gospel preachers, Pentecostal preachers, those who didn't have a voice historically in American politics, like the way that so many of the white evangelical pastors had. And that thread was kind of lost this campaign cycle. That original group of the Trump pastor crowd was not out on the campaign trail. And when I would ask them about it, they said, well, we're here for the president. Like, this is about him, and that's that. But as far as the ground troops and those who were deployed, it was back to the old way things went. So that doesn't say much about the voters and in terms of how many of them were Pentecostal, but it was an interesting difference from 2 years ago with some of the leadership.
Yeah, I'll try and take a stab at the last two. One, on the conflict, I think class is going to be a big conflict. You essentially have a coalition between very affluent white voters and relatively less affluent Latino and African Americans. And the cultural side of this, the religious side, eventually the economic side. My sense is in both parties, we're watching competing versions of identity politics. Trump is saying they are out to get you and we have to stand up. And Democrats are saying I'm with her or I'm with them or I'm with, and there's not a sense of the common good, which is feeds the polarization rather than overcomes it. Which leads me to my concluding remarks. On December 4th, we are having a session here, actually over at the ICC auditorium, on emerging leaders on polarization in a broken church and nation, where we have John Gehring, a columnist for Commonweal, and Gloria Purvis, a journalist who works at EWTN, an African American. We have Elisa Taliano, who works with the Sisters of Life and the Given Institute, and Hoffman Ospino, who is one of the leading articulators of a Latino agenda in the church. This is an outcome from our polarization gathering, but we're going to try and answer some of that question. Is it always the case that our politics shapes our faith instead of the other way around? I try and figure out, when you have smart people like this, what are the takeaways? Here are three of my takeaways. Latinos will be neglected at our peril. They are not only the future, they're the present. There are some cracks in the evangelical consensus, particularly among younger people and women. And EJ's famous line, there is no Catholic vote, and it's really important. As I close, let me share one other line. Thanksgiving is November 22nd. 54 years ago, John Kennedy was assassinated. And I remember a speech, I think it was at American University, it might have been the inaugural address, where he said, here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. Our faith should be an asset in public life. We're not where we need to be. And our initiative and the people in this room and these wonderful panelists are doing all we can to understand it better and to make it more real. Here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. Thank you very much.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live every day, with news and policy issues that impact you. Coming up Tuesday morning, Concerned Veterans for America's Dan Caldwell and Vote Vets Will Fisher discuss veterans issues. Then Wall Street Journal reporter Jennifer Maloney talks about FDA efforts to keep teenagers from using e-cigarettes. Be sure to watch C-SPAN's Washington Journal, live at 7 a.m. Eastern Tuesday morning. Join the discussion. Coming up tonight on C-SPAN, a Justice Department forum about free speech on college campuses. First, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein and Tennessee Senator Lamar Alexander, followed by former ACLU President Nadine Strossen. After that, White House correspondents on media and politics. And later, a discussion on the 2018 midterms and how faith impacted voters. Next, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein and Senate Education Committee Chair Lamar Alexander discussed free speech on college campuses. This was part of a Justice Department event on the topic and the role government plays in engaging with university officials on freedom of speech policies. This is 40 Minutes.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on Constitution Day to discuss a topic central to the rule of law in America. I want to say a special thanks to Jesse Panuccio, who is our acting Associate Attorney General, and his team for putting together a superb agenda and inviting so many superb speakers. More than a decade elapsed between the adoption of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, a decade during which our citizens devoted significant attention to the question of how best to secure the blessings of liberty. On this 231st anniversary of the Constitution, we properly praise the written document for establishing the framework of liberty, but the Constitution obviously did not write itself, nor did it take effect automatically. The drafters engaged in a lengthy debate about first principles, and the people carefully considered the terms before accepting them. Their decision reflected free thought, and it required free speech. As Jesse described it this morning, freedom of speech was a precondition for the American Republic. Listening to contentious debate and engaging rhetorically with opponents is at the heart of our nation. As Thomas Jefferson wrote, wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. And whenever things get so far wrong as to attract their notice, they may be relied upon to set them to rights. Thanks to the open exchange of ideas and concerns, a consensus developed in 1787 that America needed a new form of government. The founders chose a democratic republic governed by the rule of law. The rule of law was the subject of Abraham Lincoln's first published speech. He prophetically titled it The Perpetuation of Our Democratic Institutions. The year was 1838. The founding fathers had passed away, and Lincoln was alarmed by the sharp political divisions of his era. He advocated building respect for the law as a way to hold society together. 2 decades later, in 1858, Lincoln engaged in a series of debates with his Senate opponent, Stephen Douglas. The opening speaker addressed the audience for 1 hour. The opponent then took an hour and a half to reply. Then the first debater spent another half hour to respond. People disagreed, sometimes vehemently, but they listened patiently, and they learned about opposing arguments. That sometimes messy process remains essential because our system of government is not self-executing. It relies on wisdom and self-restraint. In a democratic republic, liberty is protected by cultural norms as well as by constitutional text. Theodore Roosevelt observed that the survival of a republic depends on the character of the average citizen. He said that the average citizen must be a good citizen if our republics are to succeed. Debates and disagreements about public policy and political leadership are essential to building good citizens. The question for today's forum is how to respond when college administrators seek to prohibit or even to punish speech protected by the Constitution. On college campuses, ideally, students hear about different perspectives. They test conflicting arguments, and they learn how to decide for themselves what is true, what is right, and what is just. And to do that properly, colleges must expose students to a range of alternatives. And I say that as a parent who just sent my first child off to college, and I expect her to learn a wide range of alternatives and learn how to make her own decisions and choose from among conflicting ideas. And yet we repeatedly hear about examples of hostility to free speech and viewpoint diversity on college campuses. Professors, students, and guest speakers are shouted down and even physically attacked for expressing their views or in an effort to prevent them from expressing their views. As Attorney General Sessions said this morning, suppression of competing voices is not the American way. Our next speaker brings considerable expertise and experience to this forum. A graduate of Vanderbilt University and the New York University School of Law, Senator Lamar Alexander spent a large portion of his life in and around campuses. His mother was a school teacher, and his father was a school principal. He rose to become the Secretary of Education and then a university president. While not serving in government, he worked as a lawyer and as an entrepreneur. But during his successful campaign for governor in 1978, Senator Alexander was known for walking across his home state of Tennessee, dressed in casual attire, to engage his fellow citizens in face-to-face conversations about public policy. He repeated that approach when he ran for president in 2000, driving across the country in an SUV. In 2002, he won election to the United States Senate, where he serves as the chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. He continues to devote substantial time and attention to the issues of free speech in higher education. Senator Alexander well understands the importance of education and the role of free speech in supporting it. So please join me in welcoming Senator Alexander to discuss the congressional perspective about free speech on college campuses. Thank you. Thank you, sir. As we were walking down here this afternoon, Senator Alexander pointed out to me that in addition to the parts of his biography that I mentioned to you, he actually was an intern here in the Department of Justice many, many years ago, 50 some odd